Hey, Browns fans, Spencer German, Anthony Meglin with you. I'm coming to you live from Indianapolis. We got Lucas Oil Stadium behind me where we are obviously covering the NFL Combine. Very much enjoying it. Day one, I guess technically yesterday was day one, day two, whatever. Day one for the Browns because Andrew Berry spoke today, and he had some interesting things to say. But certainly looking forward to being here with you throughout the week and covering all things Cleveland Browns. And it was an eventful day one. We found out some things, Anthony, from Andrew Berry, I think, from a mindset standpoint of how the Browns are going to kind of approach this offseason potentially, but also some interesting sort of off the field conversations that are going on. Those are things that happen during the offseason months as well, with rule proposals, potential plans for training camp. I'll leave it up to you. Let's spin the wheel here. Where do you want to start? Do you want to start with the off the field stuff, or do you want to start with kind of the scouting, the main reason we're supposed to be here, the scouting side of it?
I think, in my opinion, I think we start with the scouting stuff. I think
Okay.
that's a good place to dive into. But before we do that, it's so fun. This is like the start of the year, if you will. All the content we consume, every podcast we listen to, every show that we watch, feels really fresh today because there's new stuff. There's a new crop of NFL players coming to town, and they're coming to Indianapolis, and it's exciting. It's an exciting time. It's the start of the 2024 NFL league year, and this is it's awesome to kind of get things going here.
Yeah, no doubt about it. I sort of wrote, I know earlier this week, that the combine sort of feels like the unofficial start of the new league year. I understand like the new league year doesn't actually get going until March 13th, but this is the time where you get a lot of the chatter among agents and GMs and coaches and owners about all these different things that could be transpiring. We should maybe know a little bit more information about what the Bears want to do, for example, at number one by the time this week kind of concludes. We'll start hearing reports of that stuff. So it's an exciting time, and we're certainly happy to be here covering it for you. I think from the Browns' perspective, Anthony, what's one of the most interesting things that Barry kind of talked about today, just in terms of their mindset this offseason and kind of how they're approaching things, is this idea that, I think the quote was something about how in 2020, they make the playoffs, but they were pretty aggressive that next offseason in terms of adding guys to the roster. And he basically said, like, I don't know that we feel like we have to do that. He did say it's about like where they feel like they're at with the roster at this point. And I think it's important to keep in mind, guys, like all but I think 4 starting players from last year are currently under contract. So between both sides of the ball, there's only 4 that are not currently under contract. That's a big deal. This team seems like they're pretty stacked in terms of bringing back a lot of the guys that were key contributors this past year, and that should bode well for a team in terms of consistency and continuity and building this thing moving forward and trying to kind of it's more like a reload rather than a rebuild going into 2024.
It's a huge deal, and it's like you think back to it too. Like a lot of the content today that was kind of coming out was a reminder of how beat up this team was. Right, a lot of the questions that Barry fielded today were like, "Hey, you have 3 tackles who are coming off of season-ending injury.
Yeah.
You have a quarterback coming off a season-ending injury. You have a running back coming off a season-ending injury." And it's like, yeah, we talked about it all year this year, and like the Browns were able to still win in spite of those things. But you kind of forget about it. You kind of put that on the back burner. But with that said, you think back to 2020 and it was like, hey, this team maybe overachieved or played a little bit better than what they were. The team in 2023, like you could say underachieved because of all the injuries that they felt, So when you hear Andrew Berry say, hey, we don't have to be as aggressive, it is because this roster is pretty well built. And now you do have to be smart and strategic in free agency. But I think you come into it with the feel and the comfort that, hey, if we can bring some of our key guys back, we feel really good, and you got to hope that, hey, maybe the injury luck's on our side next year as opposed to 2023 when everybody was just kind of getting banged up.
Yeah, and I tried to ask Andrew a question. I tried to ask him a question kind of alluding to that thought. Like, how do you not get so caught up in the fact that you had so many injuries this year? And the way I worded it, he kind of laughed at it with the whole idea of living in your fears. And he was like, we're not going to live in our fears. So, it's football. Guys are going to get hurt. But I thought it was interesting just because I thought it was an interesting question just because, this team was so strapped by injuries this past year. I think that in some level has to kind of seep into the psyche of how you do business. And okay, how many offensive linemen do we want? How many defensive linemen do we want?
Yeah.
What are we trying to do with the quarterback position now that we know Deshaun is coming off of an injury? So it's just things to consider. But he had some fun with that one for sure. Yeah. I think one of the other interesting things was in relation to kind of just the roster. He joked that he can't seem to keep his money in his pocket when it comes to his draft picks. It burns a hole in his pocket basically. So when posed the question of whether or not he'd be trading a second round pick again or not, he downplayed it and said he didn't really want to answer it, but we'll kind of see what happens. I think this is an organization that always kind of keeps that stuff close to the vest anyway. I think it's always fair to go in and assume they could swing a deal and move that pick. Andrew Berry's always going to be aggressive. But I don't know at this point that they necessarily feel like they have to.
Yeah, and I think, in my opinion, there's two scenarios where I think that you see some movement. In my opinion, if I was in Andrew Berry's shoes, and obviously this is on February 27th, so we got 2 months to the draft. But it got a guy like Xavier Worthy who becomes available or is still on the board, at pick 40, pick 45. Maybe you do jump up and you leverage or you use some of your draft capital to get there. Or the flip side, this receiver class is so deep that if you're maybe top 3-4 guys go before you're up, maybe you do trade back and maybe you do gather a couple later round picks or a couple third rounders or some future stuff to drop back and maybe get an interior defensive lineman or get a guy like Malachi Corley who could be on the board a little bit later than 55. So there's a bunch of scenarios and we'll get into it as we get closer. But hey, there's a couple things, and that I think Andrew Berry's proven that he'll do what's best for the team. And, whether that is jump up and draft a Grant Delpit, or that is fall back and still be able to snag a guy like MJ Emerson or guys like that. He's proven that, he's very calculated in what he does on draft night.
I think what's also I'll say this real quick, is you bring up most of these wide receivers and this being a very deep wide receiver class. I guess I could see, and I've kind of brought this up, I honestly think if the Browns are going to add a wide receiver, like a veteran wide receiver, I think it's going to be via trade rather than via free agency. I just don't think they're going to be willing to foot the bill on like a Gabe Davis because his price is going to go up as other guys get signed that are in this free agent class right now. So I think it's more likely they'd acquire a wide receiver that way. So maybe they'd move a second round pick in that scenario. I don't know. But because the wide receiver class is so deep, and I know Andrew Berry was kind of asked about that. He joked, there's a lot of good players at wide receiver, but also a lot of other positions. Well, we're going to assess everything. He didn't want to say anything definitive on what he's going to do or where his head's at, which again, they like to keep that stuff close to the vest. But yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if, as excited as people are getting about potentially adding a wide receiver in free agency or whatever this offseason, I wouldn't be surprised if they actually don't and they ended up just drafting one or maybe trading up to draft one, and that's their kind of big wide receiver move.
Yeah, absolutely. We did it last year with Elijah Moore, right? You package that second round pick and you send it to the Jets and you get him back. And it's everything he does is calculated, right? And we'll sit and we'll write our stories and you and I will talk about it. But the reality is that their mind's made up in a couple different areas. Hey, we're not going to spend if Gabe Davis's asking price gets over X dollars, we aren't doing it. We aren't going to entertain it because, they're very strategic in what they do, not only for the now, but he talked about it today in a couple of his radio shows. They plan, 2, 3, 4 years out in advance. How will a contract now impact the Cleveland Browns in 2026 or 2027? So, he's super calculated in that. And it's really interesting to see how he operates, throughout the offseason.
No doubt about it. In terms of the off-the-field stuff, I thought one of the biggest stories from today, and I was surprised it didn't get more run. I didn't really see a lot of people talking about nationally, but I was surprised by that, is that the Browns are one of the teams at the forefront of this rule change that they're proposing coming up in the league's annual meetings, which will be next month, to push the trade deadline back 2 additional weeks, so it would fall in week 10, which this season that would have been November 14th. I think this is a fascinating sort of development here. It's a fascinating conversation. I'm surprised nobody's really brought it up to this point because the idea that the trade deadline is a little bit later, and Andrew Berry, you can find the video. I know I shared it at Spencito _ on Twitter, but also on our website, BrownsDigest.com. He explained it very eloquently, the 4 sort of bullet points of why they think they need to move back. And one of them was that, when they added a 17th game, they kept it at week 8, which was the halfway point originally. But we're obviously now in a 17-game season, so it doesn't really make sense. And that there's the potential to add an 18th game at some point, and then you're even further, in the further away from the middle of the season. So I think that's a good reason. I also think too, if you think about it, like a team like the Titans comes to mind. I want to say the Titans were like a game under 500 at the trade deadline or something like that. They were like 3-4. Okay, 2 weeks later, they were 3-6. So now you're talking about a team that like, okay, we're around 500. We might still want to give this thing a shot after week 8 and like not trade anybody and see if we can make the playoffs. 2 weeks later, they might be more inclined to say, hey, you know what? Let's trade Derrick Henry because we think we're out of it now. And so you actually, I think it fuels almost more action from the league to make that day even more exciting for fans as well, where you'll actually see, like we always talk about how great the NBA trade deadline is. There's always all kinds of different stuff going on. It could almost be like that where you get more teams involved and more teams willing to part ways with players because you're deeper in the season and you kind of have a read on where your team's at.
Yeah, and he said that the Browns proposed moving it back to week 10, which and he went into a couple other interesting stats. He's like, yeah, in the past whatever year, or he said no team's been eliminated before week 11, and the 2 teams that had been eliminated at week 12 were in 2012 and 2014. So he's like, hey, at least at that point in time, you have an idea of where you're going to go. And to your point, like it eliminates the gray area, right? If you're 3-6, you can be in sell mode. Think of all the baseball teams, right, who are at the trade deadline. Fortunately for the Guardians over the past couple of years, for any Tribe fans out there or Guards fans out there, like, we've been in buy mode, right, where we can go get a piece at the deadline. Well, when the deadline is 47% of the way through the season, you're still in that gray area. Like, I don't want to make a wrong choice. We're going to ride it out with our team. Whereas, like you said, teams can, really define, hey, we're selling on this year, or hey, we're really buying in. And then they can get super aggressive at the deadline. It makes so much sense. It's like, why can't they just take it right to Goodell? Goodell's there somewhere. Why can't they just take it right to him and be like, hey, let's do this? Because it makes too much sense.
You bring up baseball, and he used that analogy as well. Baseball and basketball, he said if you sort of do the math on the number of games and where they're at in the season, baseball and basketball basically have their trade deadline about 65% of the way through the season. He said hockey has it at like 72% of the season or 78% of the season, something like that. And we have ours at like 45%. So why, and moving it to week 10 makes it at about like 55%. So you're still behind those other 4 major sports, but it certainly adds a little bit more potential for action, which I think is exciting. So I love that trade proposal, or that rule proposal. I think it's a really good concept and a really good idea. And I think Andrew Berry, when he brings that to the table next month, is going to have a lot of good evidence and a very solid argument to sort of pitch to his fellow GMs. He did joke though, because somebody asked him like, "What's the argument against it?" He said, "You'd be surprised. There's some people who really don't want to move it back," which is just weird to me. But
it makes
whatever.
no sense, because for everybody, if you're a team like Pittsburgh, even like, hey, maybe you weren't thinking this year is going to go as well as it may look, and then you start to get on a little win streak. Boom, let's go. Let's add a piece or something.
He wouldn't elaborate what the reasoning was, like what reasoning other GMs give for not doing it, but I can't think of one off the top of my head that would be a reason why you don't, unless you're just stuck in the past and you're like, I don't want to see more action on the trade deadline day. Last thing that was notable, I think, from today was the announcement, or reveal, I should say, from Andrew Berry, that the team will be starting the training camp this summer in August, or I guess late July into August, at the Greenbrier yet again, which I think is a testament to, I mean, we heard it all year, Anthony. Those guys in that locker room cited the Greenbrier as one of the major reasons why that team was so close. They kept saying, oh man, we got together at the Greenbrier. It was like going to summer camp, and we really bonded, and that kind of got the momentum started on this thing. So I think the simple answer on why they're doing this again is they're trying to kind of replicate that again this year and have sort of that authentic team building built in. We'll see if it works the second time around, but I can't blame them for doing that. They also did note that they are going to do joint practices again this year, 4th straight year in a row. They will host this one. It'll be against the Minnesota Vikings, who will come to Berea, obviously, during training camp as well.
Yeah, I think the Greenbrier point is so big. Like you said, every time this team faced another element of adversity, I mean, every single week these guys were talking about the Greenbrier in their post game press
Yeah,
conferences and their
yeah.
practice. Like it was like, holy cow, what the heck happened there? But it is super cool. It's really
It
cool.
was it was it almost felt very like Coltian, like, oh,
Yeah, like
there's a Browns Colt there or something like that. What the
they
hell's
had
going
like a
on?
witch there. They were doing like witchcraft or something. But like, it's super cool that I think back to like Miles Garrett, like they did a whole thing on him taking a hike and really like using his
Yeah,
photography stuff. And it's like, hey, when you're in Cleveland and you get into camp mode, it's like Cleveland, the Browns do their camp at their facility. So you go to the facility and you go home. Right. You can only walk in the Metro Park so many times where it's like, hey, you get somewhere new. These guys can go play golf in their off time, or they can, go on a hike, go do something. That's super important when you get in the grind mode of camp, where it's like, hey, you got to break up the monotony of every single day of the same meetings to practice, to recovery, to lunch, to meetings, all that stuff. So it's really, really cool. And then the fact that, these grown men and these professionals are just locked under one roof, right? They're locked in. All they can do is be with each other. They can't be with their wives or their kids or their girlfriends. They have to just be with each other, and that does build a pretty special bond. So I'm fired up about that. I think it's really good for the Browns.
Yeah, we'll see by the time training camp rolls around if it has the same impact as last year. In the meantime, though, we do encourage you all to like, comment, subscribe to the Browns Digest YouTube channel, where some of you might be watching this. We will continue to have content for you all throughout the week. Kevin Stefanski will be speaking tomorrow on Wednesday. His time is around 1:15. So we'll have some video from that, and we'll have some more stories and things to share with you from what he says about the team's offseason plans moving forward as well. You can, again, follow along with all of our stories, all the latest Browns news over at BrownsDigest.com. We appreciate you guys tuning on in with us. As I said, be sure to keep on following along at BrownsDigest.com and the Browns Digest YouTube page as we keep the coverage coming from Indianapolis at the NFL Combine.